This video was not brought to you by Raid Shadow Legends, but by my own raging hubris. I've gone too deep and you're coming with me. This game's time sponsoring every YouTube video in existence seems to be firmly over, but just a few years ago you couldn't spend 10 minutes on this website without seeing a sponsorship for Raid Shadow Legends. The ad copy everyone had to read generally went something like this. Something something PvP battles, 3D graphics, something something free to play, something something guilds and tournaments. Oh yeah, and a great story, allegedly.
It's an amazing storyline.
Amazing storyline.
Amazing storyline.
Wow, this game looks like it has an amazing storyline.
I've never heard anyone talk about the story. Have you? It's a mobile gacha game. How much of a story could it have? Before we get into it, let's get this out of the way. Why am I even doing this?
Because I've lost control of my life.
Why am I choosing to care about the story of that obnoxious mobile gacha game that paid big YouTubers to talk it up for a few years? Because all art, even the least artistic, most corporate kind of art, has talented artists and craftspeople behind it. For now, anyway. I have worked and spoken with people who put genuine care into projects that, in their final form, I didn't end up valuing. Name a standard, bland, multi-camera sitcom from the 2000s that nobody remembers, and I guarantee you there are people who cared, be they set designers, costumers, gaffers, lighting technicians, and yes, even the writers and actors. Maybe it's not everyone on a given project, and the worse something turns out, the greater likelihood that the amount of passion put into it from the key players is small, but people do break their backs for these projects. Somebody cared about Baby Geniuses 4. It was probably Jon Voight when he learned he'd get to do Brownface and Yellowface in the same movie. They made this in 2014, by the way. I myself have done creative work for projects I did not fully care about or believe in at the start, but in order to do a good job, I made myself care. I, frankly, can't imagine myself doing thankless, unnoticed work for a gacha game whose marketing strategy reeks of corporate soullessness. Raid Shadow Legends has a story. The team at Plarium decided it was worth including in at least some of their advertisements as a selling point. They got Paul C.R. Monk to write its story and at least some of its lore texts. He's an actual published author with a historical fiction series, and who also has extensive experience writing for video games like Assassin's Creed Syndicate and The Council. Not work lauded as the best the medium has to offer by any means, but works that have their fans and are, at the very least, story-driven. Monk is a real writer who did real work, and while I have zero personal knowledge of the man and how he thinks, I know if I were in his shoes, I'd like that work to be recognized, even if by someone who may be about to be pretty critical of it. And besides, it's not unheard of for gacha games to have real stories. The Nier and Kingdom Hearts series both have such games that are genuine, meaningful additions to their storylines. Or at least they did before they were shut down. One final clarification. I did not download or play the game at all. I found a compilation of the cutscenes on the Sam Solstice YouTube channel, and referred to campaign walkthrough videos by Setham to double check if there was any additional story within the gameplay itself, and to look at the prologue tutorial section. From what I could gather, the only story content in the game itself that I haven't seen is in-game lore blurbs, which can be found online anyway. The story is not choice-driven, so I'm not missing out on that potential narrative element. And if my reference material is outdated and there have been changes to the campaign or tutorial, I couldn't find any evidence of that, so I'm sticking with the original cutscenes and gameplay footage. But all of this means that I cannot fairly judge Raid Shadow Legends as a full game experience, and I won't pretend to do so. I'm only looking at its narrative, and that I intend to engage with as earnestly as I can. So, Raid Shadow Legends, a game that has a story.
Raid Shadow Legends. I mean, wow.
I'm going to assume that you are unfamiliar with the plot of Raid Shadow Legends, so forgive me if I resort to more summary than I'd normally prefer to get us all on the same page. The campaign begins with a flashy action prologue featuring arguably the game's 4 signature characters: Gallic the Orc, Athel the Human, and the elves Kale and Elhain. They're in service to an entity called the Arbiter. No, not that Arbiter, this one. And they're looking for some sort of artifact in a dragon's treasure hoard. We quickly get dialogue establishing these characters' personalities. Elhain comes across as a grim, no-nonsense professional. Gallic is a hostile brute who doesn't seem to be working with the heroes of his own free will, since he refers to himself as bound by the Arbiter.
But you cannot bar me forever, Elf. You and I will have our day.
Kale is snarky, but also a bit egotistical. Feels quite MCU Loki. Ethel just feels like a bland leader hero. They banter for a bit, and it's obvious that Gallic and Kale don't like the others. Gallic especially dislikes Elhain because she's an orc hunter, so this presents the heroes as competent fighters but certainly not friends, and this arbiter figure is willing to force some people to serve her. Then the dragon shows up and kills Elhain immediately. Gallic and Kale laugh at her misfortune before the dragon immolates the rest of the party, prompting the arbiter to warily remark that she thought this team would be the ones, but they weren't ready. We're ejected into the game's overworld as the arbiter continues to exposit directly to us that the setting of the world, Teleria, is in trouble because of the dark forces of someone called Siroth. The Arbiter is Teleria's guardian, whatever that means, but she's running low on power and now we have to take over for her. This intro throws a lot of vague proper nouns at us without much definition, so a new player is left to just fill in the meanings with assumed cliché. Teleria is the world, Siroth is evil, the Arbiter is good, and the rest is stock fantasy. It's also not said who the player is supposed to be within the fiction of the world. I can guess that perhaps we're of the same cosmic species as the Arbiter, somehow able to take over her role, but neither that possibility nor its lore implications are clear at this time. The last part of the Arbiter passing the torch to the player involves selecting which of the 4 heroes the dragon just killed will get revived as the player's starter champion. These characters are never relevant to the campaign again as characters, because there's no longer a guarantee which of them a given player will have in their party. The player then gets a tutorial about the standard mobile game base management mechanics before the Arbiter introduces the first real campaign mission. The King of Kaerok has, in the words of the Arbiter, fallen to the shadow. Once noble and just, he has brought war upon his allies and ruin on his people. The player has to send their heroes to Kaerok to fight their way to the king and find out if he has, quote, turned to Siroth. This leads us into our first cutscene, and for the rest of the campaign, this is where the entirety of the story is told. Rather than being in-engine cutscenes like we got with the 4 signature heroes in the prologue, these are art slides under narration. The narration is all done by one guy, who describes the events from a detached, third-person, omniscient perspective, and sometimes performs direct quotes from the characters himself, rather than them having their own voice acting. I assume Plarium decided individual character voice acting would work for the prologue to get people into the game, but wasn't a worthwhile investment elsewhere, especially since as a mobile game, you can assume most players have the audio muted. So the style of cutscene gives the rest of the campaign the feeling of a storybook epic, light on characterization and more focused on the mythic tone of the world-shaking events that are described. The prose achieves this tone decently. The first of these cutscenes gives us slightly more background detail about what King Teba's deal is. Kaerok and Aravia have long lived side by side in peace until Teba suddenly declares war on Aravia and crushes his own people with taxes to raise revenue to fund his war. The Arbiter wants the player's heroes, henceforth referred to as the Company, to negotiate with the king to, quote, renounce his folly and wayward policies. I guess this is the Arbiter's place to do, to send soldiers to persuade the king to change not just his military policies but his taxation as well, with violent incursion into the king's palace being very much on the table as a potential strategy.
You call this a diplomatic solution?
No, I call it aggressive negotiations.
One clear flaw in the prose is a continued presumed familiarity with the proper nouns it's using. In the cutscene at the end of the chapter, the narration refers to bannerlords with no definition. I completely understand the game doesn't want to drown a player in exposition, and someone who's curious can probably check out the game's lore entries, but this assumed familiarity will likely mean that all details will just wash over anyone who is not familiar and come across as filler words for generic concepts. However, the assumed familiarity does create a sense that the campaign, especially the narrated cutscenes, is a legend within the universe, written as if we were Telerians hearing tales about concepts we already know well. Keep that in mind. So King Teba is not in his castle, but apparently his soldiers were shouting about Siroth, the Lord of Darkness. The possibility of external corruption, suggested earlier by the Arbiter, is brought up once again. Keep this in mind too. The company ventures forth to find the king, and their journey takes them to the once glorious city of Arnok. It is described thusly.
Peopled by desperate refugees, it had become an unclean place made darker by unknown horrors spawned in the encroaching shadow.
The placement of unclean feels very strange. It seems like the narration is trying to make us feel sorry for the refugees, but the placement of unclean implicitly includes them within that descriptor, even though the real blame for the state of the city is meant to lie at the feet of the encroaching shadow. It doesn't feel like the refugees made things unclean is the intended reading, but the sentence structure still suggests it. Anyway, the company decides to venture into the city's sewers, which is known to be the dangerous territory of the lizard men. So immediately I must ask, were the lizard men always relegated to the sewers? Was this a feature of Arnock's good times or a part of the city's decay? Or are they meant to be some of the unknown horrors spawned in the encroaching shadow? Even after delving into the lore, a lot of this isn't clear, but suffice it to say for now that the lizard men are a normal sapient species in Teleria. So if they have always been living in the sewers, that implies some really dark things about this once glorious city. But maybe they were pushed into the sewers recently, post-corruption. We don't know. The only clarification the campaign gives us is to claim that the lizard men were tainted by Shadow, once again attributing danger to the external corruptive nature of Siroth's shadow. This is driven home in the next chapter. The company tracks the king to a temple in Narbuk. The pros first mention the place as the Temple of Narbuk, which made me think Narbuk was a god, but there's only two gods in the setting that I'm aware of: Lumaya, the good goddess of light, and Siroth, the evil god of darkness. The way we're just rushing through these proper nouns is still a bit overwhelming. This happens again when the company finds King Teba within the undead-filled catacombs. It turns out he has been, quote, bewitched and forced to wage the terrible war. It seems the spell he's been under has taken a toll on him, and with his dying breaths he asks the company to ask Queen Ava to forgive him and find the cause of the corrupting shadow. Because the prose assumes familiarity with Ava, and this is the first time we hear her name, I thought this was his wife at first. But no, she's the leader of Aravia, the kingdom that he's been waging war against. So that's the next stop. On the way, the company has to travel through the Durham Forest. I guess North Carolina is in Teleria. And there's dark elves there. They ask the company for a toll, and King Teba's signet ring doesn't count, so they very quickly jump to violence. Gameplay happens, and the final boss of this area is a dragon, marking the first time the final boss in gameplay is story relevant. As the narrator explains, after the dragon has been dealt with, the Dark Elves have been extorting war refugees and sending anyone who can't pay to get eaten by the dragon. This is also the cutscene where it's clearly stated, outside of any lore text entries, that Queen Ava and other Aravians are High Elves, establishing that we are very much doing a High Elves are good, Dark Elves are evil dichotomy. In fact, this is the first time that the enemy faction is not explicitly stated to be in some way influenced by Siroth's darkness. While diving deeper into the lore makes it clear that Siroth is, in fact, the source of the Dark Elves being dark, just looking at the campaign makes it seem like the Dark Elves actually have some agency in their evil in a way that King Teba and the Lizard Men were implied to not have. The next chapter is Felwyn's Gate, a huge wall at Aravia's border currently seeing a wave of war refugees trying to get in. Notably, the narration describes the refugees as being human folk, lizard men, elven. So lizard men are confirmed, even for people unfamiliar with the lore, to be a sapient race in the same vein as humans and elves. This makes the Arnok chapter even stranger for how it just glosses over why the city's sewers are populated by Siroth-corrupted, hostile lizard men. I'd like to step back a moment and say that this glossing over in this situation and others does create a specific narrative effect that leads to a way to read the campaign that I'll actually describe later. I'm not just bringing it up to nitpick at plot holes. Anyway, these refugees are being kept away by guards composed of Ogren and Skinwalkers, whoever those people are. They seem to fall into the same category of Dungeons & Dragons fantasy races as hobgoblins, meaning basically orcs but made to be distinct in some way. The company fights through these guards and breaks open the gates, letting refugees pour into the elven lands of Aravia, but one Skinwalker claims that they had a reason for turning the refugees away. Ominous. In the next chapter, the heroes arrive at the elven capital, and guards welcome the company in. The narration really hammers home that the elves are suspicious in their hospitality, and then suddenly gameplay happens where the company is fighting elves. The boss of the area is a monstrous elf lady, and then in the ending conversation it turns out that this monster was actually Queen Ava, who had been also corrupted by the shadow. According to the narrator,
It was she who had betrayed the king, had fomented the war between Kirok and Aravia.
These chapters' cutscenes are the ones with by far the most holes, since we don't see the moment the elves turn hostile and how the fighting with the company starts. We also do not get any actual screen presence from Queen Ava, just her corpse after the boss fight. King Teba gets a scene where the narrator speaks his words, and even the Skinwalker, who non-specifically warns about the Queen's treachery, gets actual lines, but not Ava, someone who seems like an extremely important character within the world. Whatever caused her corruption is unexplored, and she never gets to speak for herself. But her evil is tied directly to Siroth, like everybody else's. So the company decides to disguise itself as normal refugees to figure out what Ava was planning to do with them. It turns out she was going to send them to a town called Tilshire, where the necromancer Bad El-Khazar and his orc minions are gathering people for some sinister purpose. You know Bad El-Khazar is bad because his name is literally bad. Anyway, Khazar identifies the company as Queen Killers and has the orcs attack. He actually gets dialogue via the narrator, good for him. Though I'm not sure why the orcs would care that the company are Queen Killers, as if they'd have any loyalty to an elven queen. But anyway, Khazar is a servant of Siroth. He runs away while the company is dealing with his guards, and then a great white eagle swoops in with a message from the Arbiter telling the heroes to go to the Deadlands to stop a dark mass. Note the wording used here, dark mass, invoking a warped version of the Christian sacrament ritual where the wine and bread representing Jesus' blood and body are eaten. It's not just using the generic word ritual. I assume that Khazar is also going to the Deadlands because the company's next step after receiving these orders is to pursue him on a ship, catch up with him, and defeat him. This also frees the Knights of the Sacred Order from Khazar's control. One of them, named Kenric, promises to help the heroes. I'm not sure exactly what help this entails, the cutscenes don't say, but I assume they fight with the company as they find an ancient temple of the goddess Lumaya within the Deadlands. This desert area is evocatively described as full of ruins from before the brimstone dragon came and scorched the earth. That's a neat little bit of hinting at world history in a way that is easily understandable without much context, even if a big dragon once messed stuff up isn't the most unique thing in the world. It's a moment where the mythic tone of the prose really works to elevate the less original material. So there are barbarians in the area working for Siroth to protect the Dark Mass. It seems like Khazar was the one organizing this ritual, and even though he's dead, what he has set in motion continues on. The so-called corruption remains in the souls of the captured people who are serving as the Dark Mass's congregation. So then the Arbiter shows up to tell the company that she will purify the congregation, and the heroes have to go back up the Sacred Order at Godfrey's Crossing as they attack the demon priests of the Hallowed Halls, who exist. I guess the Arbiter was able to recover enough of her depleted strength to cleanse corruption from dozens if not hundreds of people, but needed the player to take over summoning the heroes to form the company and manage the base. I get it, sometimes you just need a vacation for a couple days. The company goes to Godfrey's Crossing, but it seems the battle has already happened, and the Sacred Order has been thoroughly defeated. Kenric is dying. You remember iconic character Kenric, right? The one Sacred Order guy who got a name, who promised to help the company? He's dying, and the narrator speaks his dying words.
O valiant knights, he hailed. In your crusade against evil, you have redeemed your order. He then lifted his eyes to the sky. Fear not, noble lords. May your souls ascend to the light of Lamaya.
The Sacred Order can be redeemed for the terrible things done under Siroth's corruption. I'm not entirely certain how long this corruption has lasted, or what some of these deeds may have been. Odd. I'm sure it won't be relevant later in this video. So the company pushes forward into the Hallowed Halls, and the chief of the Knights Revenant, whoever they are, tempts the company to join Siroth, promising some vague reward. As the narrator says,
the spell of the shadow was at its most potent in these halls.
I guess that means the environment gives this Knight Revenant an advantage on his persuasion rolls. Unfortunately, the heroes are seemingly impervious to even a hint of temptation, and they continue fighting. Gameplay happens, and the boss of this area is some unnamed demon priest who prophesies vaguely about the company's impending death. The narrator asks,
was the sinister prophecy of the demon priest but a sham to prevent them from blazing a trail to the source of evil?
Again, the heroes are resolute. The narrator says their goal is to restore balance between light and darkness, which is the first time such balance is mentioned. Up to now, darkness is treated like a corrosive, corrupting influence, but now the narration is implying that it's actually sort of a yin and yang situation, with darkness being part of a greater balance. There's no confrontation with Siroth directly, only a boss called Kaivos, a fell demon. There isn't much of a hint at Siroth's motivations or really any greater plan beyond his servants causing the leaders of the two major factions we've heard about to go to war and cause chaos. After Kaivos falls, the company has to use their own life force, or the combined force of their shards, to seal the demonic gate, killing them and fulfilling the demon priest's prophecy. This will supposedly banish the shadow from Teleria, which, again, does not seem like balance to me, but whatever. The company, I guess, does so, it's conveyed a little confusingly, but the Arbiter keeps the heroes alive because she knows that Siroth will come back and try to wreck things yet again. And that's where we end. So that seems pretty thin, pretty bare bones. Obviously just a plot for the sake of saying there is a plot. Nothing in there worth discussing more analytically, right? Wrong.
You fool!
Let's begin with structure. The campaign is a series of moments of heroes vanquishing evil across a variety of situations, in a journey entirely objective-driven rather than character-driven. Throughout my summary, I consistently pointed out gaps in motivation for various characters, and also moments where the heroes are straightforwardly righteous and heroic. This might not make for good scenes of drama, but it does create the feeling of a morality play in an epic register. The heroes are pure and dutiful and good, and are otherwise complete blank slates in order to accommodate all possible champion summons. Everything they do is treated as righteous, even things that may actually seem less noble. There is no character arc, no moment of doubt or crisis of faith, simply a procession of events in which evil rears its ugly head in new and varied forms to be vanquished. Evil itself is presented as something eternally external, always coming from the god of evil, Siroth. It is other, it is not found naturally within the people of Teleria. King Teba was corrupted and not acting of his own free will. Queen Ava was corrupted, and it's unclear if she invited her corruption or was similarly bewitched. The only antagonists not clearly aligned with Siroth are the Dark Elves and the guards of Felwyn's Gate. But the lore reveals the Dark Elves were products of Siroth, and the Gate Guards were not actually bad people. We don't know from these cutscenes what Bad El Khazar's deal is and how he entered Siroth's service, but as a necromancer he is clearly apart from Teleria in a similar way as the demon spawn. So much of this narrative feels like moralistic, Manichaean Christian fantasy in all but name, all about instructing virtue for the sake of a holy war against evil. Consider Edmund Spenser's 1590 epic poem, The Faerie Queen, a fixture of the English literary canon. It consists of 6 books, each one focusing on a different knight meant to represent a different holy virtue. It's considered one of the great allegories, and Spenser claimed, in a letter he wrote to Sir Walter Raleigh, commonly printed as a foreword in modern printings, that the intent of the poem is to model righteous behavior. To quote Spenser, "The general end, therefore, of all the book is to fashion a gentleman or noble person in virtuous and gentle discipline, which for that I conceived should be most plausible and pleasing, being colored with an historical fiction, the which the most part of men delight to read, rather for variety of matter than for profit of the ensample. I chose the history of King Arthur, as most fit for the excellency of his person, being made famous by many men's former works, and also furthest from the danger of envy and suspicion of present time." He goes on to say, "By ensample of which excellent poets, I labor to portrait in Archer, before he was king, the image of a brave knight, perfected in the 12 private moral virtues, as Aristotle hath devised, the which is the purpose of these first 12 books." Yeah, back then they weren't really big on consistent spelling or not doing run-on sentences. Now, scholars generally agree that the Faerie Queen is more than just an allegory, and that there is real interiority to interpret in its characters beyond what they represent. But this does still speak to an intent within this revered work of literature to be instructive, and it was written to curry primary favor with Queen Elizabeth I, meaning that it clearly has a pro-Elizabeth, pro-establishment message to it, even if scholars have interpreted elements of subtle critique of her. So what would the Fairy Queen look like if there were no real characters to analyze, and instead of being over 36,000 lines of poetry, it amounted to snippets of prose that could be read aloud in just 15 minutes? Well, maybe it would resemble the campaign of Raid Shadow Legends. In this game, we have righteous heroes who stave off temptation and are not distracted by possible tricks from evil beings, like the Demon Priest's prophecy. They faithfully obey their divine patron and have no character traits beyond this, no interiority to analyze. They're simply pure good, embodiments of Lumayan values. Now, in Christianity, whether or not human beings are innately sinful is a bit of a messy concept that different denominations seem to have different thoughts on, and I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but I do think for simplicity's sake, it's fair to say that there is at least a widespread attitude among many Christians that the general adult population is sinful by default, unless they choose to turn to Jesus. Raid Shadow Legends implies that the people of Teleria are all innately good, unless otherwise tainted by the direct and deliberate machinations of Siroth. Every bad thing is directly tied to the shadow bewitching people or tricking them or using direct otherworldly servants. And the Arbiter is a true paragon, a divine instrument of Lumaya's will that is as fair and just as she. It's simple, it's straightforward. And the fact that it's all told from one person's narration over illustrations hammers home the morality tale feeling, like the events of the story are being filtered to us through the perspective of this biased narrator. Perhaps I would not be so eager to call him unreliable if not for the fact that the first story content, the first bit of writing in the game, is also the only bit where any of the involved characters get to speak for themselves, and they present a dramatically different picture. The four signature heroes of the game who feature in the tutorial are not paragons of morality. They act like mercenaries and do not get along at all. They threaten each other. Kale and Gallic joke and celebrate when Elhain is killed, and Gallic pretty clearly states that the Arbiter has pressed him into involuntary service. Upon their deaths, the Arbiter is dispassionate, uncaring. Now, perhaps this is because she knows all of them can be revived, eventually, even if for now she only has the power to bring back one, but it still indicates a callousness I would not expect from the strongest agent of light and good in a Christian-esque morality tale. I would expect such a figure to be presented as warm and kind even with the trappings of a warrior, resembling a Christian military saint. Is she so deserving of the loyalty demonstrated by the company's rejection of the knight-errant's temptation to turn evil when she regards them as little more than expendable pawns? Perhaps the company just knows that the Arbiter can keep reviving them over and over, as she does at the very end of the campaign, to allow them to sacrifice their own lives without consequence. Perhaps the company is not so righteous, they simply side with the entity willing to give them infinite life. Now, look, I know that actually the good guys are secretly evil is the most basic media hot take 101 approach one can take, but there is so much in Raid Shadow Legends that makes such a reading seem very obvious. Or, if not evil, the good guys can be easily read as morally compromised and being presented in a deliberately propagandized way. The game begins with the prologue giving all the characters edgier portrayals, setting up a morally grey world before we begin the much more simplistic narrated cutscenes. Our first impression of the Arbiter is of a callous demigoddess when she gets to speak for herself, but comes across as more noble when the narrator speaks for her. Then, throughout the narration, we are presented with instance after instance of situations not being what they initially seem, priming us to persistently question our perceptions. King Taba's villainy is not of his own volition, he is actually a good person. The Dark Elves present themselves as offering safe passage only to trick or attack people who cannot pay. The guards at Felwyn's Gate appear like thugs turning away refugees, but are actually trying to protect them from Queen Ava, who herself initially seems like a benevolent leader only to turn out to be somehow corrupted by Siroth. The Sacred Order is, I guess, an enemy group until after Bad Alcazar is defeated, and then it turns out that like King Taba, they were good good all along and just corrupted. So if we're being taught by most of the first 2/3 of the story to expect things to not be as they seem, does that not directly invite us to be suspicious of the Arbiter? An alternative reading may be that the Arbiter appears callous at first, but later it's clear that she's a good and righteous person. After all, each of the above examples of deceptive appearances have the mask be the first impression and the true self revealed later. The Arbiter's first appearance is the more negative one, and her positive portrayal comes after. Additionally, the rest of the deceptive appearances in the game serve the earlier notion that everyone is innately good and all evil comes from Siroth. So, if we apply both patterns to the Arbiter, this should mean that she may seem callous but is really noble, and was likely just worn down and exhausted from her constant fighting and resummonings that drained her power to the point the player is necessary. However, I don't find this especially compelling because of the different storytelling methods between the Arbiter's direct tutorial persona and the later appearance filtered through the narrator. The extra layer provided by the narration makes applying the patterns to the Arbiter's portrayal outside of it feel less warranted. I am tempted to find a more optimistic reading of the mask's theme because it could convey the message that no matter how evil someone may seem, there is good in them somewhere. Even if it's too late to find it, like with Queen Ava, the Sacred Order and Kenrick demonstrate that if one can be reached, one can find redemption. But it is too late for Queen Ava. Teba being good all along is little comfort because he dies before he can truly fix any of the damage he did under Siroth's control. It seems like a hollow comfort. So yeah, there's something sinister about the good guys read does seem like the most intuitive. I'm just too suspicious of the shift in narrative mode from direct to indirect storytelling once the narrated cutscenes start up. And attributing all evil to Siroth feels too convenient. There's no interest in exploring how Ava fell to corruption, or what Bad Alcazar's deal is. The campaign of Raid Shadow Legends feels like the kind of propaganda you'd expect to find in-universe, telling an inspiring and straightforward story that devotees to the Arbiter and Lumaya like to think they enact whenever they go to war against the forces of Siroth. They are at once noble heroes and also faceless, flawless suits of armor, able to be valorized without the pesky showing of flaws that more specificity would allow and even require. It conveys the virtue of humility, that a hero should not seek glory of person and should instead aspire to glory of deed and purity. If, from an in-universe perspective, heroes are taught to expect to be made more symbols than people, and to completely forfeit their own identities, it could perhaps make them easier to control. Now, is it possible that the tutorial and campaign were written by different people, and that this explains the tonal clash rather than the intent being to provoke this analysis of propaganda? Isn't it just cheaper and easier for the game developers to use narration over art slides than fully animated cutscenes, and that's why the narrator speaks for all the characters? Isn't the vague, characterless portrayal of the company just a way to make sure that every possible permutation of summonable gacha characters can be accounted for? Well, none of that is incompatible with my analysis of the effect these choices all have on the narrative. This is what Death of the Author actually means, despite the frequent misapplication of the term when talking about wanting to enjoy works of art by controversial or uncontroversially despicable artists. Death of the Author means that the intent of an author does not invalidate alternative readings of their work, as long as those readings are supported by details within the text. So if you, for example, approach a paper-thin narrative thrown together for a free-to-play gambling game told through cutscenes players can't even replay after seeing them the first time, and you find details present in the text that lead to an at least somewhat deeper meaning, that's still valid. While I think it's quite likely that Paul C.R. Monk wrote whatever parts of the game he wrote based more on structural limitations than a desire to portray in-universe morality propaganda, that is still the main thing I took away from the campaign. But then again, the campaign itself is too sparse on details that I can reach for as truth behind the propaganda. There's the prologue, and then there's the notable detail that the Arbiter sends the company after King Teba in a manner that resembles a CIA regime change operation. But beyond that, all I really have is suspicion of an overly simple narrative, and questions about certain concepts and factions that the campaign has tantalizingly few details about. And I don't want to just leave my analysis at the good guys aren't so good, because like I said, that's fairly one note. But aside from connecting its formal style to older literary traditions, I don't know if there's much more meat on the bones of these sparse cutscenes. I have to go deeper. Luckily for me, Raid Shadow Legends produced a limited animated web series, kind of like their own Arcane, but way shorter. That's good, right? Arcane gave depth to League of Legends characters that the game, as a storyless MOBA, could not do itself. So let's check out this series, Call of the Arbiter.
These lands used to belong to the clans. We are reclaiming what is rightfully ours. This man led the human oppressors. Whatever it takes.
Oh. Okay. This is a choice? Let's back up. Call of the Arbiter was released in 2023, 5 years after Shadow Legends came out, so the franchise name is just Raid, I guess. That was pretty obvious from the game title structure, but now that there's more than one thing named Raid subtitle, it feels clearer than it did for whatever reason. I hope the Bug Spray company is okay with that. Paul C.R. Monk did not return, or is not credited as returning at least, and his personal websites don't mention working on it. This animated series was written by Kendall Deacon Davis and Alex Hawley, with Davis given more of the spotlight in the behind-the-scenes videos. It was directed by Jay Oliva, the director of a lot of recent DC animated movies like the Flashpoint and Dark Knight Returns adaptations, and the Assault on Arkham movie set in the Batman Arkham game universe. So a different creative vision for the characters and world is to be expected, but the immediate invocation of land dispossession and the leader of these raiders talking about oppressors and justice before trying to murder a baby feels like quite a whiplash in sensibility. Alright, let's recap this series. It consists of 10 episodes. The first 4 give backstory and characterization to the 4 signature characters found in the game's tutorial, and the 5th episode brings them together as the Arbiter recruits them for a mission. The Arbiter has become weak after centuries of fighting against the dark forces of Siroth, and asks the 4 gathered heroes to find 4 pieces of her old armor and weaponry, which will give her enough power to manifest on Teleria once again. Well, 3 pieces, since the 4 heroes are brought together at the location of her helmet. The heroes split up so Ethel and Gallic can find the Arbiter's breastplate and Kale and Elhain can find her shield. Ethel and Gallic recruit the lizard man Yizzo to help their search because he saw the breastplate in a dream, and he helps them retrieve it from a giant spider.
Now you must still survive.
Meanwhile, Kale and Elhain end up accidentally picking up the dwarf Newt as they retrieve the shield from a demon the dwarf was hunting with some of his clan. Their hunt takes the heroes to what looks like the demon realm to get the Arbiter's sword, only for a demon spawn lady named Allure to swoop in and snatch it away. She has been in the service of Bad El-Khazar ever since he saved her from Sacred Order knights that slaughtered her demon spawn family, and she brings him the sword. However, the sword is cursed, and Bad El-Khazar tricks her into taking on the curse to unsheath it, allowing him to wield it for himself. Why he burned the loyalty of a willing servant he raised from childhood just to unsheath a sword instead of having one of his skeletons do it, I don't know. Maybe he's so old that the time it took him to raise her is insignificant to him. Maybe an undead thrall couldn't unsheath it. Maybe he's just evil. Anyway, the heroes manage to save Allure, and she decides to help them for the sake of revenge. Allure then tells the heroes and us Bad El-Khazar's backstory. He was once a student called Valkanen attending a magic school, but kept getting one-upped by his rival Arion, who made the bigger fireballs and got all the girls. I get that the episode is only a few minutes long, so we couldn't go fully in depth, but it's funny that from what we see, the only thing that goes on in wizard school is young wizards doing stunts to impress each other and get laid. So Valkanen turned to the devil, as you do when you're an incel, and accidentally sacrificed a huge group of his peers as he bound his soul to Siroth. He then became the necromancer he is today. Bad El-Khazar plans to unseal what's called the Tower of Beasts using the sword, unleashing a huge army of monsters he will presumably be able to control. The heroes fight their way up to him and manage to bring the artifacts together and re-summon the Arbiter. Then the series ends as the reformed Arbiter and Bad El-Khazar prepare to charge at each other. As I showed before, this Call of the Arbiter series takes efforts to bring more moral ambiguity to Teleria than we can see in the game's campaign. The orcs see the humans as stealing their lands and oppressing them. The High Elves and Dark Elves have a long history of distrust and hatred that Kale and Elhain see as pointless and self-destructive. Allure's seemingly peaceful demon family was slaughtered by invading knights, and Ethel found the Sacred Order dogmatic and stifling rather than righteous warriors for goodness. This is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of effectiveness, largely because the short length of the episodes and the focus on the characters means that the broader issues can only be given cursory mention, to hint at moral ambiguity rather than truly depict it. Take the orcs. Their leader, Gallic's father Artak, uses the language of oppressed people fighting for liberation, referencing an off-screen history of specious violence. But the story of the episode is Gallic deciding that he does not agree with the indiscriminate, violent way his clan is raiding this human city, and it's only 5 minutes long, so we get no details on the actual oppression dynamic. We only get the orcs being violent while gesturing vaguely at sympathetic motives, and Gallic heroically saving this baby, who turns out to be Athel, and denouncing his father and the cause. Artak says that Athel's dad is
responsible for the deaths of hundreds of orcs.
And we just have to take him at his word for that, I guess. Otherwise, it seems like the orcs are just using this language as justification for murder, which sure does happen in real life. But with them being the first and only representation of this kind of rhetoric, it implicitly casts anybody using it as similarly disingenuous. It's an attempt at invoking moral complexity that ends up ultimately just reinforcing a black and white dichotomy. This feels very White Fang from RWBY, with Gallic as Blake and his dad as Adam Taurus, I guess. But it's even less fleshed out, with all the clumsy handling of huge, delicate topics that comparison implies. Gallic feels like a completely different character than the very limited bit of his personality we saw in the game's prologue. There, he was angry, resentful at the Arbiter for forcing him to work for her, and actively hostile to his teammates. Here, he is good-hearted and empathetic. We could consider this a retcon in characterization. I'm sure it's meant to be, like how we're not really meant to remember that Leslie Knope started out as a gender-swapped Michael Scott by the time Parks and Recreation reaches its later seasons. But it might be more interesting to not think of it that way. Put a pin in that. Athel doesn't really conflict in characterization because out of the main four, her personality in the game prologue was by far the least substantial. She just seemed generically heroic and actually tried to get along with the others, who did not reciprocate. In her episode, we see that she grew up in the Sacred Order's home citadel and trained to be a warrior like one of them, but was drawn to what the Order considers heretical texts that actually contain information about the Arbiter. So the Sacred Order has, as it turns out, turned away from the righteous light of Lumaya and the Arbiter and slid into more authoritarian dogma. Is this because of Siroth? There's no firm assurance that this is the case like we might get in the campaign, so unless you're already considering the possibility, you'd likely read this as simple human fallibility, which again, I'm sure is the intent. Importantly, we get a small glimpse into the cosmology of Teleria when Athel reads one of the forbidden texts that refers to Lumaya and Siroth as sort of yin-yang figures, like the campaign narrator referred to them as exactly once. These books also say that Lumaya created the Arbiter as a guide for mortals, but Athel's friend Shamael says these statements are heretical. It seems that the Sacred Order lost its way long before Bad Alcazar was able to mind control Kenric and the others to serve him, but these failings were not at all hinted at in the campaign, lending further credence to the interpretation of the game as in-universe propaganda. The Kingdom of Karok having its fraught history with the orcs is never brought up in that narration either, if you had to ask. Kale and Elhain's episodes go together because they are a couple. It's a star-crossed lover's story. Interesting to consider when later on in the timeline, Kale reacts to his true love being eaten by a dragon like this.
Well, that could have gone better.
Anyway, their episode begins with the Arbiter saying,
"None have escaped the torment of war, but hidden deep in the world, there is a cure."
This suggests that the cure for war is the love that can bloom on the battlefield, you might say. Regardless, the High Elves and Dark Elves are two people who have been in conflict for ages. The Dark Elves were all exiled from Aravia, and they want to return home, and the Arbiter's description of the High Elves' resistance to this is simply that the High Elves
had not forgotten that the Dark Elves had fallen from grace.
So this alludes to the corruption from Siroth, giving a spiritual component to this conflict and ultimately justifying the the High Elves' position. They contain what's called the influence of evil. It speaks to a mindset at least present within the High Elves and possibly the Arbiter that unfaithfulness to Lumaya and being at all influenced by Siroth is a sin worthy of permanent excommunication. Again, the vagueness of what happened, what Siroth's influence may have compelled the Dark Elves to do, makes this presentation difficult to take at face value. This actually does carry on the way the game campaign makes all evil in the world come from Siroth, with the natural side effect that any sign of Siroth's influence must be a sign of evil. Even Kale, the heroic Dark Elf who wants peace, does not really dispute this. When he hears Elhain's plea for peace at the summit between elves, he brings her to a cave temple in order to show that
the shadow that stained the Dark Elves could be purified.
So even from the perspective of our main Dark Elf character, the problem is not that the High Elves were being unreasonably prejudicial, but that the High Elves actually just need to help cure the Dark Elves of their cosmic evil somehow, instead of shunning them. Meanwhile, Queen Ava, who in the future will join with Siroth, does not come across particularly well when Elhain voices the most basic milquetoast appeal for peace, and Ava calls her niece's ideas too radical. So, as was true with the campaign, I feel suspicious of how good the good guys really are, but there's little presented to make me see good in the supposed bad guys. Oh yeah, Elhain is Queen Ava's niece. While I know the campaign was written the way it was to work even for players who do not have Elhain unlocked, and back then maybe this family connection wasn't even a thing, this makes the complete lack of any real scenes with Game Ava even more disappointing in retrospect. Anyway, the story of Kale and Elhain basically has the two of them fall in love as they plan for peace, but duty calls Elhain away and she can't tell Kale for some reason, so he thinks she's abandoned him and he leads the Dark Elves on a raid against Ava's palace. But the two lovers reunite, they immediately realize they still love each other, and they decide to unite against both their people before the Arbiter whisks them away. So I'm not sure if love is the answer to war after all, Arbiter. It kind of seems like love just inspired the two lovers to abandon the war and go fight in unrelated conflicts as a couple, until this happens.
That could have gone better.
Now, I've spoken at length about the idea that all evil comes from Siroth, so I have to wonder why the Arbiter's Spotlight episode, which is really mostly about the four signature heroes coming together and is quite light on details about the Arbiter's real backstory, but whatever, includes her asking this question.
From where does evil originate? Are good and evil present in every moment?
It seems to me like we know where evil originates, but if the Arbiter is uncertain about this, perhaps I need to reconsider. Is Siroth not the root of all evil, despite all misdeeds presented in the franchise that I've seen being attributable to him? Well, this miniseries clearly returns some agency to the people of Teleria in their misdeeds, even if tracing back cause and effect still leads back to Siroth. It's unclear, based on what we've discussed so far, what the humans did to the orcs and if Siroth had any influence there, but the show doesn't indicate that he did, and there's no sign of Siroth worship in the part of Gallic's raiding clan. The Sacred Order has lost their way as devotees to Lumaya, but they aren't presented as worshipping Siroth, at least not at the time Athel was growing up with them. While Siroth is tied to the Dark Elves becoming Dark Elves in the distant past, the conflict now seems to be perpetuated by the elves themselves. Perhaps this is what the Arbiter's question hints at, that while Siroth may be the ultimate root of all evil in Teleria, he is not directly responsible for every bad thing, and mortals are perfectly capable of committing evil themselves. Even in the campaign, if we're to take the narration at face value, Queen Ava seems to have turned to Siroth willingly. Perhaps the question, from where does evil originate, leads us to the conclusion that the choices mortals make in the wake of Siroth's inciting actions continue harm beyond his direct influence. Or maybe it's just vague nonsense meant to sound profound despite not fitting the context of its world, and this whole video is my practice for the Olympic straw-grasping event, but never mind that. The miniseries has, generally, been trying to give more detail into the world and characters of Teleria than the campaign did, and has been trying to deliberately inject moral grayness. So I'm sure the Arbiter's question is meant to emphasize this new ambiguity. It's strange, though, because I feel like even as I see this miniseries peeling away the evident propaganda of the campaign, it still feels like the moral ambiguity is more of a facade. As I suggested earlier, much of this can be chalked up to the limitations inherent to few-minute-long episodes focused on quick, dramaturgically competent webisodes that focus on one character at a time. It's clear that, at least in Call of the Arbiter, these conflicts are drawing surface-level inspiration from complex real-world scenarios for the sake of quickly giving sympathetic qualities to villains without doing the topics justice. Good thing that has never ever happened in any other work of fiction before or since. But if we take this discrepancy as a feature of the story rather than a bug, it may be worth noticing that the miniseries is still filtered, even if it's not as much as the campaign. The Arbiter is narrating all of our information about the War of the Elves. We see Gallic's family speak for themselves, and that portrayal is very Ruby White Fang, but after Gallic runs from them, he enters into the Arbiter's service and then never mentions this conflict again. The show feels like it's sweeping the complexity of the Orc-human conflict under the rug, but because the show is framed by the Arbiter, it also implies, however unintentionally, that the Arbiter could be sweeping it under the rug too. The miniseries does at least give us some more nuanced depictions of the Lizard Men via their representation in the character Yizzo. He's apparently suffered unjust imprisonment simply for befriending a noblewoman, and his serene and dignified characterization gives us little reason to doubt his account of this event. Side note, when I saw the title for this episode, which is just his name, I thought it was pronounced Jizzo, and the next episode about the dwarf seemed like it would be pronounced Nut. Jizzo and Nut was a wild pair of episode titles, but they're actually pronounced Yizzo and Newt, so never mind, I guess. Yizzo is a neat enough character in his episode, though from here on, as he interacts with Athel and Gallic, we begin to see a tendency for the characters to fall into the background and not really be characterized much after their focal episodes are done. Unfortunate. We also see this character Tatsu, who says mysterious stuff about her and Yizzo having intertwined destinies, and then never appears again in the miniseries. With Newt's episode, we get to see the standard fantasy dwarves. They sure are standard with their very Nordic designs and their living underground. I do like how Newt's dad is just wearing a helmet with a huge beard sticking out of the bottom. The miniseries does not present the dwarves as particularly interesting versions of dwarves, and Newt as a character doesn't have much going on to make up for that. He seems to love his family, but then after Cale and Elhain help him take down this demon, he decides to tag along and, I guess, abandon his people. Newt and Cale immediately begin the pretty standard elf versus dwarf rivalry. At this point, it seems evident that, for whatever reason, Cale's characterization is the most consistent with his characterization in the game's prologue as a snarky jerk. Oddly, this characterization doesn't seem present in his focal episode, though to be fair, the Arbiter is narrating pretty much all of that. But as for the other three signature prologue characters, Athel seems a bit more headstrong in the series than in the game, Gallic is obviously a real hero instead of a brute, and Elhain is much more empathetic than the grim mercenary the prologue made her out to be. Also, the animators seem to have had way too much fun giving Elhain's Tonghongara Cougar's jiggle physics. Then again, this demon with a belly mouth has jiggle physics too, so whatever. Allure's episode is by far the most successful at conveying a more morally gray look into Teleria. She grew up in what looks like the demon realm, but, as revealed by lore videos we'll get into later, is probably actually a demon spawn home in Teleria's underground, with a family that was probably living in peace. Probably. Then, some knights break her door down and slaughter her family. Bad-el-Khazar shows up to take advantage of her pain and recruits her to be his servant. As Bad-el-Khazar is directly a servant of Siroth, this could support my earlier suggestion that a more complete look into evil in Teleria is a matter of responding to earlier evil and continuing a cycle. Assuming Bad-el-Khazar did not directly make these knights attack Allure's family, and we're not given any reason to think he did, that means that the evil of these knights that may have come from Siroth indirectly in the distant past is taken advantage of by an agent of Siroth in a direct way to commit additional evil. The cycle of evil, if it does exist as I've outlined it, is reciprocal. The Arbiter begins this episode by saying,
"None are beyond redemption, not even her."
And Allure's redemption ends up being joining the Arbiter's holy mission, turning from the evil god to the good god. There is a strange bit of foresight in this statement. As well as Elhain warning Allure that the sword is cursed, they both act as if they know that Allure is going to help out in the future. On the other hand, we don't see Allure do anything particularly heinous, she just gets a sword from a ruin. I'm sure she has done plenty of other bad things, but that's all off-screen. So the Arbiter's claim that anyone can be redeemed seems a bit hollow and is focused entirely on allegiance rather than deed. At the start of the next episode, when the heroes talk to Allure about Bad Alcazar, Elhain suddenly seems grimmer. Is this just the context of her interacting with someone she fought with, or is this indicating a change on her part? If it is, it's not a very detailed change, at least not yet. I can only assume that Bad Alcazar was a popular champion for people who played the game, and that's why he's the main antagonist of this miniseries, despite being just one of the servants of Siroth in the campaign. In the main game, he's not even the final boss, though it can be safely assumed that he is behind the corrupted Queen Ava scheme and the dark mass that is still in motion after his death. Perhaps his role in the campaign is to spread Siroth's darkness to the point that he isn't necessary anymore, further hammering home the idea that evil spawns more evil. The whole backstory is narrated by Allure, who would have had to be told the story by Khazar himself, so once again we have filtered narration, which I have of course been leaning on heavily for wringing depth out of this franchise. This is actually doubly filtered narration. The backstory depicts Khazar as consistently outshone by his rival to the point his jealousy made him susceptible to Siroth's influence, and he caused the deaths of all his peers by accident. There's a possibility that Khazar was actually more deliberately malicious, but I don't want to put too much emphasis on that possibility because the only evidence for this is the existence of the double filter. There's no firm counter-evidence for any of the events depicted, so right now it's just a possibility that offers no real insight into what an alternative backstory could be. Taken more at face value, this backstory continues to complicate the idea of evil in Teleria. Bad Alcazar is perhaps the most blatant example of Siroth's influence driving someone to evil, but it was his own human jealousy that made him open to accepting the Dark God as his patron. Siroth, once again, is positioned not as a wellspring of evil, but as an opportunist who preys on flaws within humanity. Another interesting note in this episode is that Allure's narration describes Khazar's dark magic as
now extended beyond illusions, mere appearances. This was real.
So implicitly, most other magic is more illusory in nature. This description of magic is strikingly similar to how magic is described as working in Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series. In the first book, A Wizard of Earthsea, which chronicles the great wizard Ged's youth and learning of magic, there's a passage where he asks one of his teachers about the difference between illusion magic and true shape-changing. The master hand looked at the jewel that glittered on Ged's palm, bright as the prize of a dragon's hoard. The old master murmured one word, Tolk, and there lay the pebble, no jewel but a rough, gray bit of rock. The master took it and held out his own hand. This is a rock. Tolk in the true speech, he said, looking mildly up at Ged now. A bit of the stone of which Roke Isle is made, a little bit of the dry land on which men live. It is itself. It is part of the world. By the illusion change, you can make it look like a diamond, or a flower, or a fly, or an eye, or a flame. The rock flickered from shape to shape as he named them, and returned to rock. But that is mere seeming. Illusion fools the beholder's senses. It makes him see and hear and feel that the thing is changed, but it does not change the thing. To change this rock into a jewel, you must change its true name. And to do that, my son, even to so small a scrap of the world, is to change the world. It can be done. Indeed, it can be done. It is the art of the master changer, and you will learn it when you are ready to learn it. But you must not change one thing, one pebble, one grain of sand, until you know what good and evil will follow on that act. The world is in balance, in equilibrium. A wizard's power of changing and of summoning can shake the balance of the world. It is dangerous, that power. It is most perilous. It must follow knowledge and serve need. To light a candle is to cast a shadow. I'm not entirely sure why Call of the Arbiter briefly, once, makes such a specific reference to Earthsea's magic system. It's not like magic is depicted this way elsewhere. Maybe it's referencing something else instead and the connection to Earthsea was unintended. But it did make me think about Earthsea, which I appreciate. You should read those books if you haven't. Lastly, the jealousy that drives Bad Alcazar to Siroth is similar to the jealousy Athel's friend Shamael briefly feels towards her in her Focus episode. There's this brief montage of her completely stomping everyone else in training and Shamael looking upset, and then he initially rejects her appeal to the missing texts and the Arbiter partly because of this jealousy. but ultimately, he chooses to support his friend. Meanwhile, Bad Alcazar was not friends with his rival. He seems to have no friends and turns to devil worship instead. That's a neat parallel, probably my favorite bit of clearly intentional storytelling out of everything we've talked about so far. The power of friendship is emphasized in the final episode when the Arbiter is brought back and she tells Khazar,
"We are not alone, Khazar. You are."
I don't have much to say about this last episode, it's just climactic fighting, though we don't see the ending. It's unclear if Bad Alcazar is killed and is revived later for the campaign, or just escapes, or if he somehow defeats the Arbiter and the heroes, or what. But it's probably safe to assume that Khazar is defeated but not killed, and is able to return years later for the time of the campaign. So once again, I ask about the prologue, the one part of the campaign not filtered by narration, that shows such a stark difference in characterization from this miniseries. One could say that the miniseries represents the new intended characterizations and storylines, so this good-hearted Gallic and loving couple Elhain and Kale are meant to replace the brutish Gallic and the barely cordial Elhain and Kale. One could say that trying to interpret these two opposing characterizations as continuous would be reaching. One would have no sense of adventure. Treating the miniseries as a direct prequel to the campaign prologue, we observe an erosion of heroism and kindness on the part of the Arbiter and the four signature champions. The Arbiter goes from caring about the heroes she summons to dispassionately dismissing their deaths at the hands of the dragon, knowing they can just be revived. Gallic grows to resent the Arbiter, and she seems to resort to forcing him to continue to serve her. Perhaps the heroes have all died and been revived before. Perhaps centuries have passed. Perhaps this is the reason for the disintegration of their camaraderie and friendship. Perhaps they are ground down by constant conflict, as the Arbiter hints at in her focal episode. Fighting Siroth for eons may not just drain literal power, but emotional strength and optimism as well. I said before that the campaign cutscenes feel like in-universe propaganda, but that may be too vague. It may not just be propaganda that people within Teleria may be told about what the heroes do, it may be the propaganda that the heroes themselves wish their adventures were like. It could be a representation of what the Arbiter wishes her struggle truly was, one where heroes do not become bitter like Gallic, where bonds of love do not fade and where the heroes willingly sacrifice themselves instead of being pushed to their deaths. Remember that the reason for the player character getting involved is that the Arbiter specifically says her power has waned, and someone else has to take over. But then, in the cutscenes, she is the one who personally comes down to purify the Dark Mass congregation, and she personally revives the heroes after their sacrifice at the end. Is the Arbiter just wishing she could still be involved in a protective role she no longer feels she occupies? Ignore the fact that she is a summonable champion, by the way. I can understand the Arbiter's callousness, her yearning for something simpler and nobler in the face of the eternal demoralizing grind. After losing so much to her endless struggle but never giving up hope, she finally manages to get her second wind thanks to the success of one last desperate measure and is able to return to the world. But then the grind resumes as normal. She and her chosen heroes do not permanently defeat Siroth or even Bad Alcazar in the miniseries, and in the campaign her energy is depleted once again. Her way out resulted in nothing but false hope. Is that what life is? A long chain of exhausting defeats with fleeting glimmers of respite and renewal only to return to the same draining patterns until you finally die? Okay, I think I might be projecting a bit onto an empty gulf in characterization that obviously resulted from new creatives coming in and retconning things for the sake of something slightly more in-depth than 0.5 dimensional. I went into this project looking for signs of interesting creativity, and while I found glimmers here and there, the most I got out of it was the unintended tension between different incompatible creative visions that might produce something neat when you force them together. That's not nothing, but it's obviously not, as so many sponsor reads promise, a great RPG story. And I do wish I could think of more than the fairly rote "the heroes are really bad" reinterpretation. Though while watching Call of the Arbiter, I did notice a sort of bonus side series of lore and behind-the-scenes videos meant to elaborate on world details hinted at in the miniseries. Maybe there's something more interesting there. So yeah, there actually is some interesting stuff in here. First, I'll go through a couple quick observations from the making of videos for the miniseries. The lead writer, Kendall Deacon Davis, claims the Call of the Arbiter miniseries is
about destiny. It's about characters who have to make a decision about who they're going to become.
And, okay, sure, I can see the whole deciding who to become thing. Even Bad Alcazar's episode fits this, as he ends up making the wrong choice while everyone else chooses heroism. Obviously, Gallic chooses to leave his people, Athel chooses to leave the Sacred Order, Elhain and Kale choose to leave their respective peoples to be together, a whole lot of people choosing to abandon their people for the sake of individualism, a direct contrast to the meaning I drew from the campaign's faceless portrayal of the company. Even Newt does this, as he seems to forget about the family he left behind to keep journeying with the Arbiter's crew. Still, the short episodes can't explore this theme very deeply. Allure doesn't make too much of a choice, she just works for Khazar until he betrays her, and then she makes the very obvious choice to help the heroes take him down for revenge. And Yizzo doesn't make much of a choice. Strangely enough, for such a simply written show, I did not pick up on this theme by myself. Maybe it seems too much like storytelling basics to jump out as a theme. Like, yeah, people choose who to become, that's what character arcs are. Or maybe it's because destiny and characters choosing who to become feel like mutually exclusive things to me. I know a lot of theological discussions about fate or manifestations of destiny in stories involve characters choosing to fulfill their destinies, with the implicit corollary being that people can choose to deny their destiny if they want, but doing so is usually frowned upon by whatever entity made that destiny. These videos do justify Call of the Arbiter with reaction videos from Raid Shadow Legends YouTubers who say the community has been clamoring for more story content. Peeking on the subreddit contradicts this, but then again, we should always be hesitant to assume people posting on a subreddit for a thing have the majority opinion. Also, Jesper Kyd composed the music for this. You know, the original composer for Assassin's Creed, Hitman, and Borderlands. Last observation before we get into the actual lore videos. These creators describe Gallic as the face of Raid, which is probably true, and I guess this is why they wanted him to be more straightforwardly heroic, but that also means if there's any character you'd expect people to notice a personality change for, it would be him. So, the lore videos reveal quite a lot about the world that is not at all evident from the campaign and miniseries, and recontextualizes quite a bit. They actually give details about the historic injustice committed against the orcs, who were repeatedly pushed out of their lands first by something called the Dragonkin Empire, and then, finally, quote, the Sacred Order's bloody purges of the Red Crusade. Oh boy, that's not something that was mentioned before, but it sure sounds bad. The Dragonkin Empire, by the way, is a precursor people of the Lizard Men. It seems like they underwent a kind of infinite empire from KOTOR fall, from ancient dominance to the species surviving but being a shell of its former self. The orcs were pushed by the Red Crusade to a place called the Sorrow Lakes, where they made an alliance called the Galen Pact with the Lizardmen, Skinwalkers, and Oghren, who tried to invade the western continent of Anhelt they originally came from. But they failed and remained relegated to the eastern continent alongside Yakai, or Fantasy Asia. Yakai has an interesting story of once being ruled by demon spawn and overthrowing them, but it's completely absent from the game and miniseries except that one lady next to Yizzo in his cell who didn't do anything. Siroth is not mentioned as being responsible for any of this, by the way, though the lore video about the Sacred Order does claim that their fight with Siroth resulted in them being exposed to the Dark God's new curses and plagues, which eroded their morality somehow and drove them to zealotry. So while Siroth is not necessarily the direct cause of the Red Crusade, he did at least grind the Sacred Order down to the point where they felt it was a good idea, and the Order is said to have teamed up with Karok's Bannerlords to do this, to quote, slaughter innocent skinwalkers, orcs, lizardmen, and Oghren in Lumaya's name. The lore video mentions that the Sacred Order was formed when the Arbiter went to Lumaya's realm, the Halls of Eternity, to bring its celestial residents, the Lightbringers, to Teleria. These Lightbringers needed mortal hosts to actually manifest in Teleria, so possessed volunteering knights, which would obliterate the host personality. I think that's a pretty rad piece of lore, actually. It feels at once sinister and noble, since these knights are sacrificing themselves to summon an otherworldly entity, but at least it's fully consensual, and the Lightbringers seem to retain their pure morality. They are said to have abandoned the Order in response to the Red Crusade, which implies they didn't participate, though they left the Order after, so maybe some did. The lore video says that, quote, the hatred of non-humans still festers within the Sacred Order today, and that sure is not mentioned in the campaign as it extols the virtues of the Sacred Order warriors who die to fight Siroth. Sounds like the Sacred Order has a whole lot more to atone for than being mind-controlled by Bad Alcazar one time, right, Kenrick? The lore video ends by saying, despite its bloody past, they can still achieve redemption. It seems like the main way to do this is to acknowledge the Arbiter instead of declaring her existence heresy. Once again, we return to the rules of the world feeling pretty Christian in morality, especially Protestantism, with the whole opening your heart to Jesus is the way you gain salvation, faith alone is what matters thing. Personally, I'd think the Sacred Order could achieve redemption by maybe not still holding hatred of non-humans, and maybe even helping the Galen Pact species reclaim or be compensated for what they lost during the Red Crusade. Maybe that would be part of it, who knows? Siroth is not mentioned as still influencing the Order. I mean, obviously Khazar mind controls them for a while, but the lingering prejudice is clearly something longer lasting than that. Similarly, the lore of the Dark Elves further complicates the idea that Siroth caused all their problems even as he plays a direct role in creating them. He deliberately wanted to hurt the Elven Kingdom Aravia, so he appeared to several elves in the shape of a so-called Dreamwalker who promised power through shadow magic. The lore video says,
while many rejected the Dreamwalker's words, he found allies among the disenfranchised, the greedy, and the reckless.
So Siroth was not going into a totally good society and flipping people from good to evil. He was taking advantage of injustices that already existed. He promised relief for the disenfranchised. He promised power to the greedy. He got them to work together, even though I'm sure many of the greedy were directly exploiting the disenfranchised. The god of evil promised power in a way that aligned the exploited with their exploiters against their own interest. Can't imagine that happening in real life. So the Elf King does what's described as a brutal crackdown, which sparks the Civil War. The Dark Elves lose and are exiled to Durham Forest, where they, quote, formed a ruthless society built on greed and blood. And it turns out it wasn't just Siroth's darkness that turned them pale and dark blue, it's because in the forest they have to eat mushrooms and bugs and stuff. From these lore videos, which I can only take as the most objective bits of story I've been looking at because these videos are narrated from an entirely out-of-universe perspective, it seems like Siroth is shaping up to be kind of like what Ares was supposed to be in the Wonder Woman movie. Not the cause of all evil, but someone egging it on and exploiting it where it already exists. But of course, that gives the good guys, the High Elves and Sacred Order, incentive to put all the blame on him, as we see in the campaign's presentation. Now, in the High Elf lore video, it says the elves were the first sapient people to, quote, emerge from the waters of life during Teleria's primordial age, and are also the closest species to Lumaya, yet they still had an exploited underclass. I can certainly understand why Siroth would target them for corruption during the campaign, and the corruption of their queen would be a huge in-universe event. Still not sure why and how she became corrupted, but it seems to have been voluntary. Aravia did accept Lizardmen, Skinwalker, and Oghren refugees from the Red Crusade, so that's nice of them at least. The episode about the Arbiter finally gives us some juicy lore, some interesting cosmology, and a shining piece of genuinely cool world building. This lore video reveals the cosmogony of Teleria. Lumaya and Siroth created the universe by dancing together. Their first dances are described as clumsy and result in the pure light and pure dark realms of the Hall of Eternity and Anathrod, and the firstborn who inhabit each, the Lightbringers and the demons, respectively. In time, the gods got to know each other better and refined their dancing, and then Teleria and mortal life was created. Lumaya was happy with Teleria and wanted to leave it at that, but Siroth wanted to keep dancing and keep creating. He convinced her to dance again, but Lumaya designated one of the Lightbringers the arbiter of the dance to make sure things didn't get too crazy. Things did get too crazy. The dance made monsters and plagues, so the Arbiter stepped in and took Lumaya into Teleria. Siroth followed with his demons, and the resulting wars on Teleria came to be known as the Great Divorce. In the end, Lumaya cast a spell that permanently banished gods and Firstborn from Teleria. Way to clean up your own mess, Lumaya. What did you think would happen if you fled into Teleria while it was still possible for Siroth and the demons to physically enter? Anyway, Lumaya and her Lightbringers were confined to the Halls of Eternity, and Siroth and his demons were stuck in Anathrod, and only the Arbiter remained. Of course, Lightbringers could manifest in the world by possessing people, and demons could do the same thing, creating demon spawn. I doubt demon spawn hosts gave up their bodies willingly, though. This is a really cool creation story, mostly because of creation through dance. I haven't seen that in most cosmogonies, especially in fantasy. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, involves Marduk fashioning the heavens and the earth from the two halves of Tiamat's corpse, thus having creation come from violence. The Greek creation myths involve a series of matings and births between the primordial entities, making creation a result of sex. Meanwhile, the Abrahamic faiths describe creation through speech. Dance, however, primarily invokes Hinduism, though some Greek myths do mention the otherwise minor figure Eurynome as performing a dance of creation. In Hinduism, Shiva's aspect Nataraja is said to have danced the universe into existence. Both of these examples are single entities dancing, though. The creation is a solitary act. Raid Shadow Legends builds on Hindu mythology. I'm gonna just let that clause linger for another moment. By adding in elements of creation through sex as an act between two cosmic entities. The dances of creation between Lumaya and Siroth are not described overtly sexually, but there are certainly implications given they result in things being created, and the separation of the two gods is called the Great Divorce. Speaking of which, that's a pretty fun name for a great cosmic war. This, buried in a lore companion video for a spin-off animated series, is the nugget of cool, interesting creativity I was hoping to find when I decided to make this stupid video. If it turns out that a language model came up with it, I'm going to walk into the desert and give up. One thing I'm not sure of, though, is what led to Siroth going from "I want to keep creating things through dance and I personify constant change," to "I will insidiously corrupt the world and invade it with demons and am the Manichaean embodiment of all evil." Maybe he wants to destroy Teleria to force Lumaya to create with him again, or at least get rid of the big block between the two gods that is the mortal realm. Maybe it's all an elaborate plan to win her back after the Great Divorce. Siroth's favorite album is Paula by Robin Thicke. Also, I think this gives a hint as to who the player character of the game is supposed to be. A Lightbringer from the Halls of Eternity who is able to manifest in the world enough to summon heroes just like the Arbiter. A video about the Demon Spawn elaborates on Allure's backstory. As it turns out, many Demon Spawn eventually abandoned Siroth after their invasions were beaten back by the Arbiter, and others who lived in Teleria as spies decided they liked the mortal world and defected. So there are small, isolated pockets of Demon Spawn in Teleria living peaceful lives, often in abandoned dwarven tunnels called holdfasts. So Allure's family was made up of defector demon spawn, and they were living in a holdfast, and the knights who attacked were just attacking for no reason. It would have been helpful to have this conveyed at all in the episode. The last bit of lore I find interesting is the undead lore. Basically, Siroth accidentally created a curse of undeath while trying to make the demon spawn in Teleria immortal. Initially, he liked having these thralls, but over time, necromancer cults formed and made so many undead that Siroth lost control, and several necromancers struck out on their own. The fact that undead and demon spawn can both break from Siroth's control complicates his seemingly overwhelming power, and once again undermines the idea that he is the mastermind of all evil. Even if he is the source, evil does not necessarily do his bidding. So, this is pretty neat. I think I'm glad I took the effort to look into this. Was this a complete waste of time? Look, I made this video because I thought it would be funny to give serious critical thought to Raid Shadow Legends, the mimetically aggressive sponsor of YouTube videos that I knew would not be able to follow through on the ad copy promising a great RPG story. But, as I said, I also wanted to see if there was creativity that shone through. Nobody dreams of being the writer of a game like Raid Shadow Legends, but because it was made before the onslaught of large language models, someone had to be. Did Paul C. R. Monk deliberately write campaign cutscenes to raise suspicion of the simplistic morality it depicted? I doubt it, but he did do a good job emulating epic prose stylings that would still be comprehensible for the players of a simple mobile game. Did Kendall Deacon Davis, Alex Hawley, and Jay Oliva mean to tell a tragic tale of how the Arbiter's moment of hope and revival was doomed not to last? I doubt it, but they did create competently structured episode scripts that effectively communicate distinct, if simplistic, characters. I don't know who made up the lore of the bonus episodes. The YouTube description just gives normal credits for Call of the Arbiter. Maybe it really was Davis, Hawley, Oliva, or even Monk, but stuff like the Great Divorce is cool. I think the main value in this video is identifying that even in a piece of art that I would only call art as a matter of category rather than quality, even in writing that exists to facilitate a gambling experience rather than anything emotionally resonant, there are still sparks of something more. Imagine what these sparks could be if they were allowed to inflame. I find myself struggling with a proper way to conclude because Raid Shadow Legends didn't turn out to be some hidden narrative gem. What a shock. I could continue on the path of that creative spark, talk about how if large language models take over the creative process there wouldn't be this spark, but the truth is that an LLM could, through random chance, regurgitate averaged out story data into a shape that does provide thought from someone willing to go wild on interpretive leaps. That would become less and less likely as these models run out of training data and undergo model collapse, of course, but if human beings can see cute faces in electric wall sockets, desperate literary analysts can glean meaning from slurry spat out by an algorithm fed on plagiarism. Large language models can successfully mimic the basic, poorly made corporate product style of art that makes up much of each medium's mainstream, because corporate entertainment companies already try to conform creativity into the meaningless trend amalgamations that LLMs are designed to produce. So a tirade about how Raid Shadow Legends contains sparks of creativity that only a human could produce might feel cathartic, but wouldn't necessarily feel true. I suppose at the end of everything what I really want to say is I see you, Raid Shadow Legends writers. You did work, spent hours of your finite time on this earth creating something, and that work went unappreciated because even people who played the game skipped past everything and the community doesn't care about the story. So, I see you. I may not consider your work impressive, but I took it seriously. Maybe too seriously. But it's what I would want for my own work, if I needed to churn out 15 minutes worth of cutscenes for a mobile gacha game, or 10 5-minute-long episodes made more to advertise in-game summons than truly tell a story. That's what we all want in some way, isn't it? To be seen. Now to never think about this game again. I have things to say about more intentionally complex stories with more specific lenses than just, here's everything I can think of about a really thin narrative. So if you want to see those, please subscribe and consider joining my Patreon like these wonderful supporters. If you want to reward me for making this monstrosity, give me a like and a comment. See you next time.
Come here, bring it to me. I wanna see what that body do. Baby, come here, bring it to me. I'll spend my night with you. Better believe it. Beep, beep, get out of my way. Move your body.